Hello, good afternoon. I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies here at AEI. I'd like to welcome all of you today to joining us for the session, Has Education Fallen for a Testing Charade? A conversation around Dan Koretz's new book, The Testing Charade, Pretending to Make Schools Better. Out from the University of Chicago this month, I believe. Is that right, Dan? All right. For those of you who are not familiar with Dan's work, which I suspect is very few of us in the room who pay attention to these issues around testing and accountability, Dan Koretz is a Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Education at Harvard University. He's a member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. His first book, Measuring Up, What Educational Testing Really Tells Us, won the 2009 Outstanding Book Award from the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. The way we're going to start today is Dan's going to take about 25 minutes to share some of his thoughts and takeaways with us from his new book. We're also then privileged to have with us two remarkably thoughtful and well-situated individuals to offer their own takes and reactions to Dan's book and what he has to share. The first is Russ Whitehurst. I think Russ is a familiar figure to everybody in this room and watching this conversation. Russ is Senior Fellow in Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution. He served as the founding director of the Institute of Education Sciences in the U.S. Department of Education. We're also lucky to have with us Nina Reese, the President and CEO of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. Nina previously served as the founding assistant deputy secretary for the Office of Innovation and Improvement at the U.S. Department of Education. Couple of big questions that I think we want to make sure we focus on today and that we make sure to ask about. One is, how do we think about the benefits of our efforts to use testing and assessment and accountability to improve schools? A second is, how do we think about the costs? The cost in terms of instruction, the cost in terms of how systems go about their work, the cost in terms of what students are actually asked to do in school. And I think the third is, wherever you come out at the end of the conversation today in terms of weighing the benefits and the costs, how do we do this better? How do we think more thoughtfully about how to make sure that we're holding schools accountable for student learning, that we are challenging ourselves to see if all students are well served, and to figure out how we meet the needs of all of our students going forward. So that's the agenda today. I think it's a big one and it's a timely one. And with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Dan.
Thanks, Rick. Is that an okay height? Can I be heard? Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Rick, for organizing this, and Grant also for putting it together. Before I start, just last night, I thought I really ought to explain why I wrote this book and what it is. If any of you have started to read it, you know it's not an academic book at all. What happened was that about 5 years ago, an editor from the University of Chicago Press came to see me, and she said, "We think you have been pulling your punches in discussing test-based accountability in your writing." And I was rather startled, and I said, "Well, yeah, of course, that's what academics do." And she said, "We want to sign you for a book in which you don't." So I delayed for about 4 years, and I finally decided I should do it. What I think pushed me over the edge was the policy in Florida of evaluating some teachers with the scores of kids in other classes and in some cases other schools. Things had gotten so extreme, and I think the harms are big enough that I finally decided to write it. And actually, there was a third factor, which Rick and I have talked about, which is that the evidence that's in this book, or a lot of it, is really quite old. We've been collecting evidence about the effects of test-based accountability in this country since 1988. It's a long time. It's over a quarter of a century. And my experience is that if you describe it politely enough, nobody pays any attention. So I thought I should describe it slightly less politely. So what I want to do, I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to have to just extract a few things. I want to talk a bit about the bottom lines in the book, what I think the costs and benefits are, a very small amount about alternatives. That's really where I'd like to see the discussion go, where we can head from here, what we can do that's better. And for substantiation, well, you'll have to read the book. Let me take this, because I don't have time to go through too much. So I'm just going to give you a bit. So first of all, what I thought I ought to do in starting this book is simply try to line up the evidence about the positive and negative effects of test-based accountability. There are positive and negative effects of both. And the question is, what's the balance? And I think the answer is fairly clear. Now, let me restate that. The answer is extremely clear, that on balance, this has been a failure. The positive effects are relatively circumscribed. I'm going to describe the biggest of them. The harms have been vast, truly vast. And there's simply no way for me to look at this balance sheet and think it's rational or even fair to continue. So it's time to face the facts and to stop pretending based on distorted test scores that things are getting better at a rate at which they're not. So what's the positive to start out, watching the time? The biggest positive is gains in elementary school mathematics. I don't know how many of you follow trend data, but the gains in fourth grade mathematics on the main national assessment, the larger national assessment, are the fastest trends up or down that we have in historical data going back to the 1950s, if you exclude trends on accountability tests, which are often far more rapid. These are very big gains. And there's reasonably solid evidence that some of it, perhaps a third, is attributable to test-based accountability. This is not trivial. However, there are a couple of flies in the ointment, 3 of them. One is that there are a total of 3 trustworthy sources about the mathematics trends of fourth graders. The other 2, the long-term trend assessment from the National Assessment and the Trends in International Math and Science study, suggest that the increase actually has been about 60% as large as the main NAEP suggests, and no one, to my knowledge, has sorted that out. The bigger one, I think, is that we have known since perhaps 1990 that one of the ways that many teachers responded to test-based accountability was by taking instructional time away from untested subjects. In some cases, simply ending instruction in untested subjects. So some of the increase, and we don't know how much, but it's not trivial, some of the increase in mathematics performance is just achievement taken away from other things. It's transferred. It isn't better instruction. And the third fly in the ointment is the only data we have for kids coming out of high school, or getting close to the end of high school. And these data, for reasons I don't have time to go into, are much weaker than the elementary school data, suggest that these gains don't last until kids get out of school. Those 2 sources are the 12th grade national assessment and the PISA international study. So that's the positive side of the ledger. And I don't mean to disparage, despite what I call flies in the ointment, the gains in mathematics. They're impressive. But at what cost? I'm going to list 4 of the costs. The first is simply absolutely pervasive bad test prep. It is everywhere. It goes on all the time. There are schools where there is no distinction between bad test prep and instruction. Now, not all test prep is bad. One of the purposes of testing is to show you where and how you need to change instruction. But bad test prep is preparation that's designed to boost scores on the specific test used for accountability rather than teaching the underlying skills. And it's absolutely rampant. The first evidence of this, to my knowledge, was published in 1988. Every study I have seen since then shows it, and it has only gotten more severe. There are 2 main types of bad test prep. I may be able to show a slide. One is called reallocation. That's simply taking time away from other things, even if they're important. And sometimes it's other things in the same subject. Right? We've had data that teachers are doing that for about 25 or 30 years. The second is much harder to describe. I and my colleagues call it coaching. It's a word that other people use differently. But basically it means tricks. Teaching kids to take advantage of incidental, unimportant characteristics of the test. So I'll actually take a minute. I want to keep this brief to show you this, 2 of them. All right, so this is a real example from Quincy, Massachusetts. I don't know why it's pronounced Quincy, but south of Boston. They had for a while a website that had 3 of the secondary school math texts. If you picked a text, you would get a page like this for every chapter. The links at the time were live test items, or not live, but live links to released test items, every test item that had been released in the previous 4 years. Why would they give this to their teachers? And if any of you know the term power standards, that's what this is. This is a way to crank up test scores because you can literally in minutes figure out which sections of the textbook you don't have to bother teaching. And if you ask teachers whether they do that, if they trust you, they will tell you they do. All right? The other form of coaching, this takes a few minutes. This is a real example from a former student of mine. In many states, for no reason whatsoever, linear equations are always introduced in this form. It's arbitrary. Any form would be arbitrary. There's nothing wrong with using this one. It's just what's wrong is always using the same one. But since it's always used in the text, it's always used in the test. So what do teachers do? Right? They literally had kids write this on the cover sheet of their math test. Now, why is that bad? Well, since everyone likes to talk about college readiness, this is what it looks like when you get to college. All right? B is not an intercept, it's a slope. I can give you lots of other examples. They just take too long, so I won't show you more now. So those are two of the results. If you read the literature on performance incentives, nothing about this other than the severity should surprise you. This is absolutely ubiquitous. It's called either Goodhart's law or Campbell's law. Why a law? Because it's ubiquitous. And it's what happens whenever you reduce performance in a complex job to too simple a set of numerical indicators. You get corruption of the indicator and corruption of the process. The question is not, will it happen? It happens in police work. It's been documented in public health. It's been documented in job training. It's been documented pretty much anywhere anybody's looked. The question is always, how bad is it? What can we do to make it less severe? And is it bad enough that it's not worth keeping the accountability system because of it? Sometimes it's worth keeping, even though there is some of this backwash. All right, the third result is simply cheating. There's lots of it. If you read the book, there's a chapter co-written by a very gifted master's student I had at the time, which outlines a truly repugnant number of publicly documented cases of cheating. Everyone knows about Atlanta, which sent people to prison. Most of you probably know about El Paso, which sent the superintendent to prison, but it's everywhere. And what's particularly disturbing is what's publicized is just the tip of the iceberg for two reasons. One is uncontroversial, one is controversial. The uncontroversial reason is that most of it goes undetected. There are, 13,000 school districts in the United States? I mean, who's going to find it? And if you read the details in that chapter, what you'll find is that when it was discovered, it was usually because of one or two really persistent people. If it hadn't been for them, it never would have seen the light of day. The El Paso case came to light because of one state representative who'd heard stories like this from his constituents and wouldn't give up. Right? The controversial reason why this is just the tip of the iceberg is that there's a great deal of test prep which is not considered cheating but ought to be. There are a lot of forms of bad test prep which are uncertain or unclear in their implications. They may partly create real gains, partly fake gains. There are some forms of test prep, I just showed you one, that can only produce fraudulent gains in performance. That's all it does. Right? So the question I pose in the book is, why do we not consider that cheating? If people are deliberately coaching kids in a way that can only produce fraudulent gains in scores, that seems like cheating to me. The last of the negative effects is the hardest to describe, and it's the least researched, to be fair. It was first brought up to me by students about 5 or 6 years ago. Every year at the end of one class, I give students a packet of examples of test prep, both good and bad. And I ask them to break into groups and sort them into good and bad based on whether they're likely to produce meaningful gains. And partly through the discussion, the first or second time I did that, a former 11th grade teacher stopped the discussion and she said, "This makes no sense or will make no sense to most young teachers." And I was really startled and I said, "Well, why not?" And she said, "You don't understand. Not only were we explicitly told to do this," one of the bad examples was something she actually had done, "but we were explicitly told that this is good instruction." And the room erupted. All the former teachers started saying, "Yes, yes, yes." All right? So there's a chapter in the book, which was also co-written by a student to some extent, where we simply looked at the books that are influential in teacher training now, Doug Lemov, Bambrick Santoyo, and it's there. And Bamberg-Santoyo tells people explicitly that good instruction is doing things that I tell people are unethical. This is the most troubling of all, because undoing that damage will take a long time. All right, so where do we go from here? What I did in the book is I organized alternatives. What do I have? I have about 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
Oh, no, you got 10
minutes. All right. I organized alternatives first by talking about principles that I think we should follow. I think there are 9 of them. And then by suggesting concrete ways we might implement those principles. And I want to say here, I say it very clearly in the book, I don't know how much of this will work. One of the things that's most aggravating to me about the test-based reforms of the last 25 years is that policymakers again and again and again said, oh, we know what will work. And they didn't find out. They didn't test it out. And in many cases, they implemented it in a way that made it impossible to find out much after the fact. So we need a lot of trials to see what will work. But I'm going to give you 4 principles that extracted from the book, none of the rest. The first is so obvious that it's almost embarrassing to have to say it, which is you have to measure what matters. I mean, that shouldn't be worth your coming here to hear, but in fact, we don't do it. When Arnie Duncan came into office, I was in a meeting about accountability, and I didn't realize what language I was using, but at one point, one of his staffers, with evident annoyance, said, "What is this other important stuff you're talking about?" And I gave him an example, which is in the book I don't have time to give you now, of math teaching by the best 4th grade teacher I've ever observed. I was a 4th grade teacher, so I know what to look for. And my question to Arnie was, can you tell me that what you're proposing to do will encourage people to behave that way? And if the answer to that is no, can you at least promise me that what you're going to propose won't discourage people from behaving that way? And the honest answers to both questions were no. The unspoken, well, actually it was sometimes spoken, but often unspoken premise of test-based accountability is if we measure a couple of things that matter, everything else good will fall along. That's absolute nonsense. We have decades of research in many fields that show that that's absolutely not what happens. If you make certain things count and make other things not count, the ones that don't count get done less. All right, so the first thing we have to do is we have to argue seriously about what's most important when we walk in a classroom door. And until we know the answer to that question, we should not be imposing accountability at all. And I suggest we start with what I call in the book the big 3. Student achievement, obviously, and that goes beyond standardized testing. Quality of instruction. Achievement is not an adequate proxy for quality of instruction. I give concrete examples of that in the book. And school climate. That's not enough, but it's a place to start. And I should have said at the beginning, but since I've mentioned testing here, this is not an anti-testing book. The problem with what we've seen in the last 25 years hasn't been standardized tests. They're, in my view, invaluable. How do we know, for example, that the achievement gap between black and white students has been slowly closing while the gap between rich and poor students has been widening? Standardized tests, right? We depend on them for monitoring if we don't corrupt them with high-stakes testing, and we depend on them, or should, for instructional improvement. That's what they were originally designed to do. But a little aside, some of the original achievement tests were, the designers of them urged teachers to administer them no later than October. Why? They said because they're not very useful for accountability, but they could be useful for helping you figure out how to teach differently. All right, so that's one. Monitor what matters and make it count. That's a couple of years of work, just arguing about that. The second is setting reasonable targets. The targets, performance targets in our system are simply nuts. I mean, they're completely irrational. They're made up out of whole cloth. The actual performance standards, proficient, are themselves arbitrary, but the people who set them, the process that's used to set them, in no cases asks people to consider what amount of improvement teachers can make by legitimate means. In fact, they're not talking about improvement at all when they set standards. They're just talking about the level of performance. And then somebody else arbitrarily says how long it takes to get there. I have calculated in some cases, since we'll use the national assessment as the best trend I've ever seen, up or down, where teachers were expected to make changes 7 times as large as that. Well, faced with that, what do? You cut corners, you cheat, or you fail, or you do all 3. All right, so we have to set targets based on what people can legitimately achieve. The third is we need counterbalancing incentives. and I guess I have about 5 minutes. Let me explain what I mean by that. I thought this was a great insight until I had a dim memory that I saw this in an article by 2 British economists 10 years ago. So it's not it was a brilliant insight, just not mine. Can I use this? So what we have in the way of incentives is frankly really perverse. Because when we go back to this, why on earth would a district administrator help his teachers cut corners? It's because of the perverse incentive system we have, where everybody from the bottom of the ladder to the top has exactly the same incentives. Get scores up. Nobody has an incentive to worry about how. So the great insight that I thought I had, but somebody else had, is there actually is, we're told, by the way, this is a business model. It sort of is, just the wrong kind of business. The example of this historically is the Soviet industrial system, the system that produced clothes that nobody wanted to buy. It doesn't work, all right? And my favorite example of that, which this is a real example, is that for a while shoe factories in the Soviet Union were held accountable for one number of shoes, right? And one year, you know this example? It's real, it's in the literature. One year there was a shortage of leather, and leather got expensive, so what do? Well, the clever answer of one of the factory managers was produce small shoes. So we have a system in which nobody is given an incentive to go in and watch how scores are improved. And Nina and I were talking briefly about the Dutch system. If you look at the Dutch system, where test scores are quite central, they have inspectors going into schools to see how scores are raised. We don't. In fact, I asked one Dutch colleague of mine who was shadowing quality reviewers in New York City to see whether they were doing anything to tamp down inappropriate test prep. And a few months later, she said, no, they're distributing it. All right, so that's the second. A third, create counterbalancing incentives. The last, and I'll wrap up after this, is monitor. And this goes back to a point I made earlier. I think it's actually unethical that we impose large-scale changes on schools without bothering to see whether they're going to work, without bothering to see what the balance of positive and negative effects is. There will always be both positive and negative, well, always negative, but you should see the balance. Education is bizarre. Well, I shouldn't say that's too strong. Unusual in that regard. In public health, in auto safety, in pharmacology, in many fields, there's an assumption that data have to be made available to responsible third parties to protect us, to evaluate us and protect us. Not in education. In education, data are the proprietary sandbox of superintendents. And I can tell you from very bitter experience, 30 years of very bitter experience, that they don't let you in if they're worried about your questions. And some do. I can name some. David Steiner in New York, Rick Mills when he was in Vermont, Ed Reedy when he was in Kentucky. There's some really noble exceptions to this. But the dominant pattern is you pose the question in advance. If it's too threatening, they don't let you in. I've been thrown out when people realize that the questions are threatening. I've been told to my face that they're worried about negative results, so I can't get data. And I'm not alone. I've had students of mine have this, colleagues of mine. This is simply unethical. We're imposing these on kids who aren't even old enough to give informed consent. And so we ought to have a little humility, recognize that whatever we do, even the things I'm recommending, in some cases won't work right. And we need to go in routinely and watch what's happening in schools. That doesn't mean every school every year, but we have to have an expectation that we will honestly look at the impact of the reforms on kids and on teachers. All right, so how to do this? This is what I'm proposing. This is just a fraction of what I'm proposing in the book, is really, really hard work. It's much harder than just dropping tests into schools. It's much more expensive if you don't count the huge amount of money that's spent on wasted instructional time in our current system. But that's actually not the hardest part, I don't think. I think the hardest part was pointed out to me by a former teacher who came to see me, and he said, it's an interlocking system. Everybody now depends on these scores. Principals depend on them for evaluating their teachers, the press depends on them, the parents depend on them, the schools that are in a market system depend on them for selling them their services. Everybody depends on these scores. Where do you break the circle? And there's some international experience suggesting it's very hard. When the system becomes this integrated, it's very, very hard to break it. There's Asian countries that have tried because of the extreme test pressure in their countries to cut back the pressure imposed by testing, and I found it very difficult to do so. But I will say, this is picking up on a point that Richard Rothstein has made, we're not going to break the circle unless we start at the top. People in schools are trapped. I was asked not long after No Child Left Behind, I'll wrap up with this, not long after, I'll wrap up. After No Child Left Behind was passed, I was asked by someone at Harvard if I would lead professional education workshops for principals about how to respond. And I thought about it for about 2 weeks, and I called her up and I said, I'm sorry, I don't know what to tell them. I think they're just caught. I don't know what they can do. And until and Richard made the same comment in much stronger terms in reference to the Atlanta cheating scandals. He said, we're willing to prosecute people up to the level of the superintendent, but we don't even talk about the people who created the pressures to which they were responding. So we have to start at the top, which is why I'm glad we're here. And I'll leave it, and one last thing, and then I'll leave it to the discussants. I don't think it's just the price of real progress to do this. I think it's an ethical responsibility to kids. So let me turn it over to whoever.
Russ, you're up, sir.
I'm up. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I assume the applause was for Dan's ending rather than I'll take whatever I can get. So, I was 9 years old, and my parents sent me to summer camp, Camp Don Lee, and there was a lake there where kids could engage in recreational swimming, but they were concerned that kids would drown, so they had a roped off area that was about 3 foot deep, and that's where you could go unless you could jump off the dock and be observed dog paddling for 5 minutes. And if you could do that, you were good to go. I thought that was a great test, right? It was high stakes, it was valid, it was criteria referenced, it was useful for instruction, there are a whole bunch of things going on there. When I was 16 years old, my parents dropped me off at the Department of Motor Vehicles to take the written licensing test. And it was very bizarre because they gave you a book ahead of time, it had all the answers in it. You just had to memorize them. And so if anything, it was a test of cognition rather than anything else, a bad test. So my point here is that you can have good tests, you can have bad tests. I think Dan does a good job of pointing out some real issues and design issues with regard to high-stakes assessment. He's very knowledgeable about them. I read the book carefully and learned something from it. I think we have to pay attention to these issues. On the other hand, I think that we've heard a kind of one-sided picture, a claim that test-based accountability has failed, that it's all warts, that there's no gain from the endeavor. And so in the limited time I have, I want to try to provide a counterbalance to that. So first point is that standardized tests measure important things that predict later outcomes. The correlation between standardized test scores in kindergarten, adjusted for parental background factors and child factors like race and gender. Correlation between that and wage earnings at age 25 to 27 is 0.41. It's a very strong correlation over such a long period of time. And as you shrink that period of time between the test and what's being predicted, the correlations get even stronger as kids move through life. So we need to pay attention to that. These are not just made up things. It's not the motor vehicles test. We're capturing something important. Second, value added, which Dan takes on rather fiercely in his book. Value added is important as well. I refer here to some research by Raj Chetty. He looked at kids in New York City, though the city wasn't named, identified kids who were assigned to high value added teachers in middle school, looked at their earnings as adults. I'll quote from the abstract. We find that students assigned to high value added teachers are more likely to attend college, earn higher salaries, and are less likely to have children as teenagers, Replacing a teacher whose value added is in the bottom 5% with an average teacher would increase the present value of students' lifetime income by approximately $250,000 per classroom. So value added, which requires tests, because you're looking at gains over the course of a year in a teacher's class, that's important. Third, test scores used wisely do in fact raise the student achievement. Here I'll refer to the work that Wyckoff and Dee have done with respect to the impact teacher evaluation system here in DC. What they report, there's a recent update of it in Education Next if you want to look there. What they report is the imposition of the impact evaluation system, which involves both test scores and classroom observations, resulted in very differential departure rates from the district. So teachers who had gotten very low scores in a particular year were much more likely to leave the district than teachers who'd gotten high scores. And that turnover had a very strong impact on student achievement. So for students in low-income schools, there was an effect size of 0.21 on student achievement attributable to the fact that good teachers had stayed and bad teachers had departed. Dan makes much in the book of how high-stakes assessments are corrupted because people can teach to the test, and I think that's a serious problem. But there's lots of research showing that the correlation between high-stakes and low-stakes tests given to the same kids in the same circumstances are high, 0.7, 0.75. So the assessments are capturing relevant information even when they are corrupted by teaching to the test. Dan would have us look at other countries to learn from their experience, some of which don't use standardized tests, others do. I would have us look at Massachusetts, which is the highest performing state in the nation. And if it were a nation, would be one of the highest performing nations in the world. This is a recent piece from The Atlantic. What are Massachusetts public schools doing right? Widely seen as the best public school system in the US, the Massachusetts school system's success can offer lessons to other states. The Massachusetts experiment with transforming public education traces back to 1993, when state leaders decided to set high standards, establish a stringent accountability system, and open its doors to charter schools. Now, that's not causal, but it's worth paying attention to. I'm going to leave to Nina some discussion of charter schools, but we certainly have evidence from high-performing charter schools, for example, those in Boston, that kids, and there's a relentless focus there on raising test scores, but the graduates of those schools are much more likely to do well in college, though not at the levels we might aspire to, than kids who are, lose the lottery and don't have that experience. And finally, I would just point out that there's a little discussion in Dan's book of politics, and any solution going forward is thoroughly embedded in the politics of what's possible, what isn't possible, who's in power and who isn't. We can't have a list of technical solutions without paying attention to how to create an appetite for them at a political level. Thank you.
Thanks, Russ. Nina.
Yes, so first, Rick, thank you for having me today at AEI. And Dan, I enjoyed reading your book, although I didn't get it until late last week, so it was kind of a crazy weekend reading this book.
There'll be a test on it.
There you go. Let me just first start by saying that I've never been to a good school that has had bad test scores, or to a bad school that has had good test scores. So I still believe, after reading this book, that test scores are a good proxy for quality. And until we're able to find something else, that is really all that we have. And as policymakers, we should be putting some weight on the test scores. And the proof for me is not even on the test scores that we see in our charter schools. If you look at KIPP, IDEA, Yes Prep, all of our high-performing networks, or the ones that I've won the Broad Prize, for instance. These students are not just doing well in the schools, they're graduating and going to and through college. So all you need to do is talk to these students to find out how well the schools serve them. And if you talk to the principals of these schools, you quickly also realize that they use testing as a diagnostic tool to make adjustments in their day-to-day teaching on a daily basis. So to a large extent, what has happened at the federal level has been the result of the lessons we've learned in our high achieving schools and the tools that high-quality principals are currently using to make their schools better. I was around when No Child Left Behind was enacted and was being implemented. I agree that some of the consequences were maybe a little bit too much at the time, but when you think about, when you talk about test-based accountability, I mean, it's worth noting that a lot of those consequences were not in fact really implemented at the state or at the local level. The first consequence was to offer parents choice in the public school system. If a school failed AYP for 2 years, that was really not enforced anywhere that I know of. The second one was access to free tutoring after school. That was somewhat enforced in a few places. But if a district didn't do right by the law, no federal fund was ever pulled back. The third consequence, corrective action. I don't know what the record on that was. Maybe Russ can remind us. And the last one, which was restructuring, was perhaps the only thing that people continued to pay attention to and remains in place now that ESSA is the law of the land. So Dan, I kind of take issue with the fact that ESSA is going to continue the whole test-based accountability movement in a significant way. I think the pendulum has definitely shifted. States are now free to design accountability systems as they wish. It's true that the law requires that they still place a premium on the test scores, and there's, I guess, one variable they can use to determine what the school's quality is, and that may not be enough. But nothing is prohibiting a state from adding other measures to their accountability system. It just so happens that at the federal level, the Department of Education is saying you have to have at least one of these other ones. The reason there's not more is perhaps because we don't know what these other things ought to look like. So I definitely think states have a lot of freedom now to design accountability systems that best suit their needs. There's no hammer or stick attached to what happens if a school is not doing well. The only consequence that's remained in place, which we are very focused on and proud of to some extent, is the fact that the bottom 5% poorest performing schools still have to, the states still have to pay attention to them and do something with those schools. And looking at the recent accountability plans that have been handed to the department, we're not seeing a lot of creative work in terms of getting these schools to really be overhauled and to a better place. And I would argue that these bottom 5% schools are poor performing schools. These are schools that have failed for 5, 6, 7 years. No one can argue that these are schools that are doing a good job, or that, that for whatever reason we're just mislabeling them because the test scores are low. So I'm eager to see if any of the states perhaps take this book, take a copy of the last pages of this book and implement some of the accountability systems that you've put in place. I think probably one of the key things prohibiting them from doing all this is because A, it's expensive, right? And putting these proctors in classrooms to look at climate and so forth is not something that will give you quick results. There's a degree of subjectivity when you send outsiders, bureaucrats, to come and look at a school. But I would argue that for us in the choice and charter movement, one of the best indicators of whether a school is doing well in states like Arizona is if parents want to send their kids to these schools. And for the longest time, we've said, well, parents really don't know how to measure quality. So the fact that we've had test scores and test-based accountability has all of a sudden given us at the national level more tools to demonstrate that, yes, these parents are in fact correct in wanting to have other options. And so I would argue that perhaps one of the ways that you could gauge school quality continues to be, what parents have to say about the school, and empowering them with greater options to make good choices with good information is probably the best way to hold schools accountable.
Terrific. Thank you, Nan. All right. Dan, well, why don't we first give you a couple of moments? I think Russ and Nina raised a number of significant issues, and if you want to take a few moments to share your thoughts and
I'll
reactions
have
to
to be
what they just put on the
selective because there are a lot of points here, and I agree with a lot of them, actually. I think I need to take a little bit of a dive into technical issues to explain my response to some of Russ's comments. I agree with most of Russ's comments, but I think most of them actually don't bear on the argument in the book. First of all, as I stressed, this is not an anti-testing book. And second, the problems I described don't depend on the quality of the tests. They happen with good tests and they happen with bad tests. Right? So, but just a couple of technical things. First of all, a technical issue in psychometrics. The single most fundamental principle in measurement is that in most cases, what we give kids to do when they sit for a test is a very small sample of something larger. And you generalize from that little thing. And until recently in Massachusetts, since you raised that, the determination of whether you had learned enough mathematics in 10 years to deserve a diploma was 42 test items. Right? So it's like a political poll. It's valuable if it allows you to generalize the whole thing. So the dog paddling example is not a test of that sort. It's not germane. Second, one of the...
Dan, finish that thought, because I think folks might not quite
because
follow.
you're not generalizing to anything else. You're basically saying, can the kid swim? Can he stay afloat? When you watch a diver in the Olympics, people will often say, well, so-and-so got the highest score. We know he's not really the best, but he got the highest score, and that's all you're measuring. Who did best jumping off right then? All right? That's not what we do when we measure performance in mathematics. We say, we've got you for 90 minutes, and we're going to try to draw an inference about what you really know. It's very much like, and teaching to that test is analogous to, say, during a presidential election, looking at polls and saying, well, Zogby's numbers are pretty big. They actually poll 1,200 people. I'm going to win this election for my candidate by persuading all 1,200 of them to vote for my candidate. Well, it worked in Florida, actually, but it doesn't usually work. Second point, this is a little more technical. One of the things that was first reported in the literature in 1998 is that test score inflation, which means scores going up more than they ought to, is not necessarily accompanied by a decrease in its relationship to other variables. All right? So what you have is it's hard to describe this, but a cloud, test 1, test 2, and that cloud just moves over. But this was shown in a study that I did and published in 1998, and if you know the mathematics, it's transparent why that happens. So finding the test scores, even inflated test scores, correlate with other things? Sure, they do. And tests, by the way, good tests do correlate with all sorts of things. I could predict a large part of the performance of people in this room if I just had an age 9 vocabulary test. The Raj Chetty case, Raj Chetty made it very clear in his article he was not, in fact, analyzing the impact of encouraging teachers to increase value added. He was saying that in a low-stakes system, the teachers who managed to improve test scores also improve the life prospects of the kids. I find that utterly unsurprising. It just isn't germane to the argument I'm making, which is solely about what happens when you put inordinate pressure on people to raise those value-added scores. One last technical point. The correlation between high stakes and low stakes tests doesn't always hold. A very gifted student of mine did a study in which she compared school value-added estimates in Houston using the state's high stakes test and a lower stakes but not low stakes test also administered to all kids. All right, and I'll just give you two findings. One is that the correlations between those value-added estimates range down to 0.27. That means pretty much a random draw. They some went up to 0.6, but they were not terribly strong. What was really troubling, I'm just cherry picking two findings, is that if you wanted to know a school's value-added rating on the high stakes test in one subject, say math, your best bet was not to ask for the school's rating, value-added rating on the lower stakes test of math. Your best bet was to ask for their high stakes rating in reading. All right, now for those few of you in the room, I don't know how many of you have, but if you studied validity work, that's a smoking gun. That means that there is a very strong effect of the high stakes itself rather than the content you're trying to measure. So let me back. I didn't mean to get too deeply into this, but I am not making an anti-testing argument at all. I think that tests have a vital role not only in improving instruction, but also in monitoring how well schools do. I mean, I study testing for a living. That's what I used to pay my mortgage. I'm not making an anti-testing argument. I'm saying we have abused tests, and the proof is in the pudding. Things have not gotten better by enough. In a few places, yes, they have. Nationwide, they have not gotten better. And all you have to do is walk into schools and see the damage. You'll see the damage that they've done.
And Dan, I'm curious, Nina made the point that, look, she said at a very gut level, she's never seen a school where you've had good test scores that's a bad school, or bad test scores and it's a good school. Are you disagreeing with that assessment?
I actually do disagree with that. I think it's very hard to find a good school with bad test scores. That part I agree with. But we have lots of cases of whole districts that are bad districts that have good test scores. I mean, way back when pressure was much lower, Prince George's County, Maryland, right nearby, was kind of the poster child of what was then called high-stakes testing, which was chicken feed compared to what we do now. One of the people in the district called it the strategy of applied anxiety, but there weren't concrete sanctions. And they had, in really poor schools, phenomenal performance. They were about, I think, 75th percentile in math and reading in a very poor district. And then they changed tests. And I remember asking H.D. Hoover at Iowa, who's one of my two mentors, I called him and I said, H.D., they changed tests. You want to make a prediction of what their rating is going to be on the new tests? And he was within 2 percentile points. He said 35th percentile. It was 33rd. All right, the rest of it was all bogus. There was a reporter at the time named Amy Goldsmith, I think, who worked for the Post, who spent 2 weeks walking through schools in Prince George's County. And she came back to my office afterwards and she said, I think I asked people an unfair question. And I said, what was the unfair question? She said, well, I went to schools that were supposedly way above average in reading, and I asked the teachers, why are these kids carrying books that are 2 years below grade level? I said, you asked exactly the right question. So yes, I think you can find, and people call me by the all the time, reporters say, we've got a school that went from 20% proficient to 74% proficient in 1 year. What do you think? I mean, you don't really need a lot of expertise to answer that question. So yes, I think you do find bad schools with good test scores, but you don't find good schools with bad test scores.
Russ, curious kind of your take on this.
Well, Dan, I want to differ with you about one thing. You said the book is not an anti-testing book. Mm-hmm. It is. When the reviews come out, if they've not already, I think I read it deeply and not hostilely. I viewed it as an anti-testing book. Because when you get to the point, I think we agree probably on most of the flaws of the system. And so when you describe and document them as you have, there's a choice point. One path to take is say, well, we have people teaching to the test. How could we redesign these tests to make it much more difficult to do that? We have instruction focused too much on the two tested subjects. What could we do to broaden that? So each of the problems could have been addressed with a potentially constructive solution. And I didn't see that. So I think at the meta level, you read the book and you come away sensing, well, as I think the book will be covered, here's a guy who deeply knowledgeable about the testing industry in America, and he says, it's a failure. We should stop doing it. And so you're not saying that, but I feel you're saying that. And so I'm responding to the impression I think that a reading of the book will convey, which I think conflicts with the very words you've used occasionally in the book and here, that it's not an anti-testing book. Again, I think it will be taken that way.
I'll just say I hope not, and I do if you read the back of the book, specifically lead by saying that testing should be a core part of what we do instead of what we're doing now.
Yeah, but it's like saying to somebody, well, I hate to be critical, but, and then you...
It's like I'm saying the medicine is misused. I'm trying to say in very strong terms, what we're doing with tests shouldn't be done. I'm not saying that testing shouldn't be done. I'm saying we've been misusing them, and that's why we haven't gotten what we've sort. By the way, making tests harder to coach, I agree with you. I spent 5 years trying to do that recently, so I agree with you there.
Russ, I'm curious though. So we just heard Dan kind of respond to your point about the Shetty study, by saying, look, this was New York data, a lower stakes environment in the 1990s. When you think, as you mentioned, kind of the D. Wyckoff study of impact, how much do you think there are real teeth and consequences in the high stakes accountability of this era? Because I think partly, when Dan describes this, Dan, I hear you talking about consequences and incentives in a very concrete sense, and I'm just kind of curious if we're seeing the same thing.
Yeah. Well, I think Nina spoke to this. I mean, the consequences that were written into No Child Left Behind were largely rhetorical rather than actual. And consequences make a difference. I mean, reputational consequences or shaming can have some effect, but other consequences are important. I think one of the misdesigns of the accountability systems, both as referenced in No Child Left Behind as well as the state systems that preceded it, is the accountability is totally focused on the school, as if the school was the unit at which instruction meaningfully occurs. But we know when we deconstruct the variance that's associated with different components of the system, you do the pie chart, you have to look real carefully to find the little sliver that represents the school variance. There was, I think, a very well-intentioned effort to move that accountability down to the teacher level, because that's where most of the variance is accounted for, and use value added. Rick Hanishek, who's over here, has written powerfully about the impact that you'd get from just eliminating the very bad teachers who tend to have fairly stable scores. So I think there are a number of design flaws with what we're doing. I think Dan usefully points those out. What we need to do is address the design flaws, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Nina, one of the things that Dan talks about at length in the book that I always wrestle with is this whole reallocation question. How much of improvement that we see is because things that used to get taught are being taught less, so that time and energy can be focused on reading and math because they're the things that are tested. I mean, obviously, particularly in a charter school environment where folks have got to worry about authorization, where there's a lot of political pressure to show that charter schools are successful. How do you think about this question of how much reallocation is going on from other subjects and skills, and how do we know about that?
Well, certainly anecdotally, there are some examples of, to the extent you have a lot of students who are coming to your school below grade level and you have to demonstrate mastery or proficiency in reading and math by a certain grade level, not just for the sake of, looking good on accountability standards, but also for philanthropic reasons. Most philanthropy right now is going to those schools that are doing really well. You are going to deviate a little bit from the other things you may want to do in the classroom towards reading and math. But I would argue, and I still maintain this to be the case, if you don't know how to read and do math, the other pieces are really not going to fall into place very easily. So I still think those two core subjects are important subjects to test. Schools are testing kids all the time anyway, so using a standardized test that actually is well crafted is probably more desirable than some of the other things that schools are administering. So it shouldn't happen, and the intent at the federal level was never to take away from the other subject matters, but to say that if you're going to focus on anything, focus on these two things first, and then some. And granted, we haven't had the resources to allocate to offering art and other subject matters, but it was unfortunate that it just became about those two subjects and took away from other subject matters. I'll also say I was on the panel at AEI a couple years ago on a study done in North Carolina that looked at the consequences of NCLB. And one of the things that study highlighted was that those schools that ended up reacting the best to the AYP designation were some of the schools in suburbs that were, all of a sudden, they had identified one subgroup that wasn't making AYP consistently. Those were the schools that were able to self-correct faster than anyone else. So again, I know you didn't like the regimented system, but the schools that are well-resourced and have good staff probably benefited from the threat or the label because they were able to quickly make adjustments.
So Dan, you closed by sketching out 4 principles for doing this better. Can you talk a little more concretely about, to Russ's and Nina's point about kind of baby and bathwater here? What are some examples that you've seen or examples you would suggest to folks at the national level as to how to start putting these principles into action?
Okay, I'm going to actually start with a concrete example. And if you haven't read the book, there is a teacher who appears about halfway through the book, a little bit further, who's from Montgomery County. Norca Padilla was her name. And I start with that example, which is the example I gave Arnie Duncan. It was the best actually it's the best elementary school, not just fourth grade math teaching I have ever seen. And so the question I've really been wrestling with for a long time, I mean, my older son, my older child, who's the one referenced in the book, is 36. This is a long time ago that he was a fourth grader. How do you encourage people to teach that way? How do you encourage people to teach in a way that's cognitively demanding, that's engaging, that gets kids to argue about what they're doing, that gets the kind of interaction that we want to see and gets kids to actually think? And I think the starting point for that is watching how people teach. And the problems in doing that, and you raised one of the biggest, are enormous. It's very hard to deal with the problem of subjectivity and evaluation. And in the American system, observations have been a joke. I mean, that's part of the reason why we have these reforms, is that the observations, everybody was good, no matter how bad they were. And they're particularly hard, by the way, in civil service systems. This is something that Derek Neal at Chicago pointed out years ago. And in civil service systems, the people doing the evaluating don't have money on the table. If I'm a business person and Grant is selling and I really like him, but he's not selling well, I'm going to give him a bad evaluation because he's losing money for me. That's not true in principles evaluating. There are ways to deal with that. Not perfectly. I mean, it's an enormous problem, but if you don't look at the quality of instruction, you're not going to get better instruction. And that's a bit of an overgeneralization. I do think that holding people accountable for the performance of their kids helps, but to do it, you have to do it in a way that doesn't create such severe side effects. And we haven't done that. So I think looking at practice is essential. I think weaning parents, you mentioned that parents using test scores to judge schools, that's part of the problem. And it's much worse now than it used to be, and it was bad before. I mean, I used to get people calling up when I first started publishing my test scores. Where are the good schools in Montgomery County? And what they really meant was, where are the schools with highest test scores? And they would get really impatient if I started talking about anything else. They didn't want to hear it. And this is part of the cycle that the student I mentioned referred to. If parents are convinced that they can use scores no matter how they are obtained to judge school quality, well, then they will. I would if they were trustworthy. I mean, it's objective, it's a hard number. So I think we have to redirect parent attention also to other aspects of school quality. And I think it's hard to pick from all these. We need to honestly evaluate what we're doing more than anything else, perhaps more than anything else. We really just don't know in many cases what's going on. I mean, the first hypothesis that disadvantaged kids were getting the short end of the stick with test-based accountability was in 1988. Bob Lynn was the person who first said it. I didn't see any data about that until 2000. And even now, there are very few studies that are able to unpack that. I actually may have one there if you want to see one. I'm not sure if I brought this slide or not. Just a very simple one. If I thought to bring well, I guess not. Oh, there we go. Let's see if I brought it. All right. This is an interesting case. This is New York State's 8th grade data on their high stakes test, which was introduced in 2006 in the national assessment. I don't know how many of you have a lot of experience with New York State's educational politics, but by 2009, there was scarcely a breathing member of the press that believed their test scores. And every year they would call a couple of people, including me, saying, is there malfeasance? Can we believe these? So in 2009, after 3 years, the scale on the left is fractions of a standard deviation. Scores in 8th grade had gone up by about 3/4 of a standard deviation. Now, if you know test score data, you can stop right there. That's not real. The 4th grade NAEP scores, which I mentioned are the best we've ever seen, up or down, are much, much slower than this, a tiny fraction of this. And at about that time, the National Assessment provided the state with embargoed copies of their results, which are the ones in red. Right? There were two political responses to this. Joel Klein said, I don't care about the NAEP. Our test what's important. David Steiner, the state commissioner, went to the press and said something is fundamentally wrong with our test scores. Right? This is near and dear to me because it got my group access to their data for 7 years. But the reason I raise this is what happens, Jen Jennings, whom some of you may know, who's just moving now to Princeton, when she was a postdoc with me, said, well, why don't we just look at these trends separately by race? There they are. This is an almost exact replica of what Steve Klein and colleagues found in Texas in 2000. What you see is that if you look at the national assessment scores, well, let's start with the state scores, which are solid lines, you see a rapid narrowing of the black-white gap. If you look at the NAEP scores, you just don't see it. There is a very slight narrowing, which is consistent with national NAEP data. If you follow it, there has been an erratic, slow narrowing of that gap, actually since before NAEP, since 5 or 6 years before NAEP was instituted. We don't have many studies like this, but they're all the same. They all show that disadvantaged kids get it worse. Right? So the way to deal with this is to make it more transparent, to make sure that we have monitoring going on enough that it isn't one study every 5 years that shows that we have a problem like this.
Russ, I'm curious. You noted that, look, as you read the book, there's some real concerns that it raises that are legitimate. If you were to put 2 or 3 ideas on the table as far as policymakers tackling this, where would you have them start?
I would go back to the 1980s and minimum competency test. I think there is, with respect to reading, I think there's broadly shared agreement that a 4th grader ought to be able to read, and that we should be able to achieve that for kids with normal brains without violating the assumptions of the normal curve. And one way to do that would be to say, this is what basic reading looks like, and let's hold schools responsible for that. And after they've accomplished that, they can do what they want. If they want to turn it into a music curriculum, go do that if they can hold on to their kids. So that's one idea I would put I'd put on the table. For state and national purposes, let's don't try to say that no child shall be left behind and every child should be competent by 2014. Let's say every school is responsible for teaching basic skills to the level of competence. If you will, it is my dog paddling test or an analog to it. I think it is important to measure other things. I would start with parental and student satisfaction. We don't have much of that, but Dan, the impressions you had of your son's math teacher are impressions that either directly or indirectly by word of mouth other parents gather about teachers. It'd be very useful to capture that in a way that doesn't depend on running into another parent in the grocery store and saying, who's the best fourth grade teacher. So parental satisfaction would be good. And we certainly would benefit, though it's a very lagging indicator, from long-term outcomes on how graduates of particular schools are doing. Because over time, that's what we really care about, not their 8th grade test scores, but whether they're living productive and satisfied lives. And so the more we could capture on that, and the more we could develop proxies for that we can assess at earlier ages, the better we would all be. And then you asked for 3, but I'll give you 4. One I think I gave you a hint of previously. We continue to focus on the school building as if it were the important unit. I do a lot of my work in preschool. You see the same thing playing out there. What are the good centers and what are the bad centers? The variance in goodness for a child within a school or a preschool center, that variance is going to be much broader than the variance between centers. And we need to focus relentlessly on teacher quality and how to improve it. Maybe some of it involves better professional development, though at a federal level, trying to identify what works in terms of improving teachers through professional development has been a big bust. Nothing seems to work very well. And so we also have to pay a lot of attention to selection and retention based on performance in the classroom. I think that's terribly important.
Nina, before we open it up for a couple of questions, curious, and particularly you mentioned before kind of the role that choice can play in tempering the focus on centralized accountability. Curious, what are a couple of directions that you would, put as where this conversation should constructively go?
So again, I think it's important to have good, strong tests and make that information available in words and terms that parents can actually understand. I would, this is not really related to testing, but I'm a big believer in weighted student funding and making sure that the dollars are following children to the school of their choice across district lines. If you have the information, the weighted student funding, those two things should be able to right-size the system. But at the end of the day, though, to the extent we haven't talked a lot about teacher quality, and the higher ed reauthorization is up for reauthorization, so I would be remiss not to just acknowledge the importance of really doubling down on ways to identify, train, and put high-quality teachers in the classroom. I think at the end of the day, those are the individuals who are going to make the greatest difference. And if they're good teachers, they'll be able to use these tests in the way that they were meant to be used. I think the problems we've run into often stem from teachers who are not necessarily as steeped in the subject matter or able to translate what they know in the classroom effectively. So in-service and some pre-service training would be important.
All right, I want to throw it out for a couple of questions. Before we do, just a couple of things. One, the event's being live streamed. Obviously, full video is going to be on the AEI website immediately after we conclude. Two, as we ask questions, as always, I would ask that you actually ask a question. If we get 15 seconds in and I can't see hide nor hair of a question coming, we're going to give somebody else a chance. And please be kind enough to just identify and introduce yourself by name and affiliation. What do we got? Brendan, who do we got? Rick. Brendan, right here, Rick.
Well, thank you. I'm Rick Hanashek from Stanford University and visiting AEI. When I read your book, all the examples were egregious of bad things. And there's partly a question of how you generalize from these examples and how you make for the big picture that the whole thing is broken. But when it comes down to the end, it's a matter of trade-offs, of whether you take some bad things that are going to happen with any system and compare that to the gains. So I'll put it into the context of last week I was in Turkey, and at the end of a talk I gave, one person ran up with a plot and said, look, the income per capita in Turkey in 1972 was exactly the same as that in Korea. And today they differ by a factor of 3. Mm-hmm. He said, how could that possibly be the case? What could be different? And the difference comes to something that's in your book about, you don't have Korea in there, you have Singapore in there, and the fact that Singapore does very well, but now maybe they're stepping back from all the incentives. Well, in Korea, you have the highest stakes of all for the kids, not necessarily for the schools, but the kids have the highest stakes of any place in the world, and you see, I think, the result of that. 3 times the GDP per capita in Korea as in Turkey. And so I want to know how you weigh these alternatives, because what you're suggesting is that we just stretch things out while we figure this all out and get all of the balance right, and that in the meantime we should just ignore these factors. And I don't understand how you get to the stop it all now, put the brakes on now, wherein the cost to the US is huge.
Rick, we've been doing this for 25 years. I mean, it's not like I'm coming out of the gate saying, don't try it. We've been doing this for 25 years, and it hasn't worked. I'm not making any argument about what has happened. I could, but I'm not making any argument about what has happened in Korea. This book is solely about what has happened in the United States. And actually, I'm going to the World Bank tomorrow to talk about things that are similar and different in different contexts. I have no doubt, though I do doubt your numbers, I don't have any doubt that an improvement in cognitive skills of our kids would improve GDP. This hasn't done it. It hasn't done it. And 25 years is a lot of kids. It's time to admit that it hasn't done it, stop pretending that it has done it, and find other ways to improve the cognitive skills of kids. I'm not disagreeing that we shouldn't improve them. We should. This just hasn't worked. And it has also imposed really serious costs. I mean, I don't want to reduce it to anecdote. You know, the old saying, anecdote, a plural of anecdotes isn't data. It's actually big data. But you know that there are states now putting out in their guidelines how teachers are supposed to respond when their kids start puking during testing. I don't treat that as trivial. Kids who don't want to go to school, kids who are ashamed because of their performance on tests, good teachers who are unable to in some cases, keep their jobs but aren't satisfied with their jobs because they're being pressured to raise scores on one test. These are real harms. And if we'd had dramatic gains like Korea's had, you might be able to say, well, all right, we'll take a few kids vomiting on their tests for that. But we haven't seen those gains. That's just a fact. That's what the data show. It is a fact that we have not seen gains like that.
So just a footnote, I thought you said that we had seen gains. I mean, it's clear that No Child Left Behind was a crummy law. It was exactly backwards of having the states decide what we should do and have the federal government say how to do it. That's exactly backwards. But we did get gains out of it. And the gains that you get, at least by calculations that I would give, suggest that it's in the trillions of dollars, the impact. We've had this before. Now you can cut my numbers in half and you still get a number that is extraordinarily large.
Connor.
Hi, this is Michelle Austin with GMMB. So I'm very sensitive to Russ's political point in the atmosphere that we're in. It is very politically expedient to say that's a bad test. Let's get rid of the test with no plan to replace it with something better, right? Always forward thinking, make it better, but in a political climate, you just get rid of it and then you just sit and wait and it throws the system into turmoil. So my question is, if in the book you look at any realities past 2010, I think New York is a great example where after 2009, there was a recalibration, right? Like, so there is more like alignment with what's expected on NAEP and what their state test shows. And you do see gains with subgroups and African-American students. And in the most recent round of test scores where disaggregated data is available in like Maryland, and, North Carolina, Rhode Island, you actually see over a 3-year period gains for African-American students and Hispanic students. So now that we're in this, post-2010 phase, Common Core phase, new assessments, across states, is that in the book too? Do you get into that? Do you have thoughts on kind of any improvements on that front?
Well, I think it's an open question. I mean, I wrote the book when states were just beginning to put forward their ESSA plans, and I agree with you. There's room for considerable improvement under ESSA relative to No Child Left Behind. It's not clear how much they'll take that opportunity. And what I didn't see anywhere was really a retreat from the basic model. Yeah, they throw in an extra variable. You can measure attendance and pretend that you're really measuring school quality. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's an open question. I mean, we've all been kind of distracted politically for the last 10 months where this is going to go. I just don't know the answer to that. I mean, in New York, I do know in detail what happened in New York. And what changed the trend line from that wasn't alignment with NAEP. What changed the trend line from that was the commissioner telling his testing contractor, we have a problem with score inflation. And it was actually on the recommendation of my research group that he told the testing contractor to make the test longer and to make it less predictable. Well, you can't do bad test prep if you can't predict the content, right? And as soon as they did that, that was in 2011, the trends leveled off. Well, after that, they changed standards. When they introduced the new test in 2011, it was not a new framework, they just made it longer. We actually, by the way, looked to see which schools and kids essentially suffered more in performance from that change in the testing, and it was, again, disadvantaged kids.
Okay, we're going to take one more question, and then Sukha.
Hi, I'm Ashira Green. I'm a doctoral candidate from University College London. So you've spoken about testing different things, and I've wondered whether, there was a discourse in the past few years about states and schools throwing tests out. So my question is, when the tests are thrown out, does the school become better in some way? And if so, what does better actually mean when that happens?
We don't have the monitoring in place to know, but if I had to bet $20, I'd suggest that some probably get better and some probably get worse. I think that the opt-out movement is another indication of how seriously tests are being misused. I mean, in New York, where the opt-out movement is strongest, people are even objecting to kids participating in field tests that had no consequences. Right? And it's because they're so fed up with what they've seen in schools. I don't think the solution is to stop testing. I think the solution is to use tests in the subjects in which they're high quality, which is not all of them, to use them as they were designed to be used. If you go back, I have students do this. There is a person whose name many of you have never heard, E.F. Lindquist, who's probably the single most important figure in the spread of achievement, standardized achievement testing in the history of the country, actually of the world. I won't take the time now because we're running short to list all of the tests he was responsible for. He wrote a wonderful article in chapter 1951 in which he said, going to Russ's point, we can't easily monitor kids until they're 22, so we're going to find proxies. All right, and the proxies have to be measuring what they're doing in school. And then he warned, this won't work if people try to raise performance on the proxies. Because this 1951, we had this warning. It'll break the relationship between the proxy and what you're really interested in. So I think the opt-out movement is just an expression of frustration, and I don't think it may make it easier to stop excessive pressure. I don't think it's going to make it easier to put in place more sensible use of tests.
Nina, final thought?
I get kind of scared when people talk about tossing tests out, because those who've benefited the most from this accountability based on test scores are poor students and minority students. Across the board, you're now able to see that you can actually improve test scores if you put a high-quality teacher in the classroom, if you increase the rigor of the coursework in the classroom and whatnot. So I hope that whatever recommendations you give to the state chiefs and whatever we get out of this is not kind of a retraction of what has happened so far, but maybe building upon what we have learned over time. The thing that I really grappled with in reading this book is I couldn't figure out if you just didn't like standardized testing, because you also didn't seem to like Common Core, and the tests pegged to the Common Core is because you think that having tests that teachers can teach to is harmful to students. But absent that, I don't know how else to know if the teacher is actually conveying what he or she should be teaching to the child. So I think it's just a huge risk to take with students who really need to be serving a lot better over time, and those minority students and low-income students should really be front and center in these discussions around accountability and choice.
Russ, final thought.
Of the very many good chapters in Dan's book, the best in my view is chapter 8. It's about unrealistic expectations. And it's about whatever you're measuring and holding people accountable for has to be not an aspirational standard. It has to be a goal that can actually be reached. I think that's true with respect to the assessment system in general. We can't have unrealistic expectations about it. It is a system, it's a set of tools, they have flaws. The question is whether there's residual value and signal there that's worth keeping and improving. I fundamentally think that's true, and to go through what we too often go through in education, which is an absolute fascination with a reform strategy for 7 or 8 years, and then we're done with that, and we'll start with another one, would be a tremendous mistake here. We've learned a lot and improved a lot from accountability systems. They can be a lot better, and it should be our goal to get to that point.
Terrific. Two final words. One, if you're interested, we've got copies of Dan's new book available right outside the doors in the hallway. If you impose yourself upon him, maybe you can even get a signature before we get out of here. Second, next week, next Tuesday, October 3rd, I hope for some of you to join us. We're going to have Eva Moskowitz join us to talk about her new book, Lessons from Success. With that, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much to the panel.